Hello. Once again, my name is Tim Grady. I'm coming to you from Lawton, Oklahoma, Seventh-Day Adventist Church, Lawton, Oklahoma, USA. I'm just a member. Today, we are just going to give an overview. Um, and I'm going to give this historical overview of why the United States is collapsing. I do not want to get into the morals of it. I do not want to get into the why some of these subjects are forcing the churches. Um, okay, why the United States is collapsing. And I'm going to give one line of why the United States is collapsing. Ida Mae Fuller. I'm sorry, Ida Mae Fuller, um, but I'm going to use you as an example. Ida Mae Fuller, as it shows here um, in the description here, first recipient of regular Social Security benefits. Now, I'm going to use her as an example because she was the first. She is not a typical person, and I'll show you why she's not a typical person. She paid in $24.75, and there's some reasons why she didn't pay in, because she was the first one. She didn't have the taxes paid uh, for her lifetime, and so on and so forth. She received a total of $22,888.92 in just Social Security benefits. That comes up to a little over 1,000 times what she paid in to what she got out. That is not, I will start out and I will preface this is not a typical person that pays in and does not pays into what they receive. Um, if you're talking just Social Security benefits. So I'm using her as an example of the first one. This is not a typical someone pays in $24 and whatever and receives $22,888 in benefits, over 1,000 times what they paid in a lifetime to what they received in a lifetime. That is not what happens in reality. Okay, so let's go to what the United States Social Security, and we're going, of course, we're using Wikipedia here. The United States Social Security is used. It was first passed in 1935, and Ida Mae Fuller was the first one to receive it in 1940. So from 35 to 40, there were 5 years. So she only paid in for 5 years. But that is not a typical person. Okay. So I'm going to go down to the chart further down in this document. And I'm going to explain why it starts in 1970. Because 1970 is when, number one, it started becoming problems for the economy. Number two is because 1970 is when someone had fully paid in to the Social Security program to receive benefits out. So that's why this chart starts in 1970, because that's when the Social Security stabilized. But it also showed when Social Security was in trouble. Okay, so we have the years down here, and we have the number of participants in millions. So we have 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, 40 million, 50 million people as of 2020 on approximately 50 million people receiving benefits. Okay. We have another 10 million people that are like my mother, like my stepmother, like my wife, and many others that did not put full benefits in, but draw benefits out. They are not the bulk of the issue. They are not the problem with Social Security, but they are an aggravator to the problem. But they draw full Social Security benefits. I'm not getting into the morality whether we should have Social Security or should not have Social Security. I'm just dealing with the fact that we had Social Security pass in 1935. 1940, 5 years later, someone started drawing Social Security. Period. I'm not getting into the morals. I'm not getting into whether we should or should not. I'm just stating this is why we are in the financial problems we are in. I am not getting into the morals of whether we should or should not, whether the churches should or should not have done. And we're dealing with what is, and we're not dealing with the full morals and discussions of the greater subject. We're only dealing with what is. So we have another 15 million people that are on SSI, Social Security disability, where they receive benefits, but they do not they did not put in their 40 credits. So they're able to receive some sort of benefit without paying in the full benefit. And again, there's about 15 to 18 million of them today. Okay, this is the number of workers. So in 1970, between all of the recipients, which was about 25 million, there were 60 million workers. Today, there are double that number of workers, but I'm not getting into that there are problems with this number, with people underemployed, overemployed, and all of the rest of that. I'm not getting into that. I am going to accept these numbers. I'm not going to say that there are illegals being paid in, that are paying in, that are not counted, and I'm not getting into all of that. I will fully accept this number of 120. I will even say I don't necessarily agree that we dropped 10 million. So I'm going to say we're at 130 million. I'm just going to accept 130 million, and we are having 70 million, or 65 million people drawing. So we have 2 workers to every 1 retiree. 2 point something, a lot of the figures say 2 point something, 2.3, 2.5. We were at 6 people paying in for every 1 worker at the time the program started. Okay, Social Security would have been okay. I understand why they did it. I do understand why they did it, why they made it, because they needed to build the Grand Coolidge. They saw World War II coming on the horizon. They knew they had to bring in the socialists, or this funded the Grand Coolidge and the big dam projects, which brought electric power to California, which brought in shipbuilding, aircraft, so on and so forth. All that went with that came in from that. Also, the Tennessee Valley Authority electrified the United States. It built infrastructure. It did a whole bunch of things. But what the problem with that is, it did build all of those things. But the workers and the baby boomers, and we went from 20 million to 60 million. We have 3 times the people retired today than we have. But the money that was supposed to be saved for those people were spent on those projects to build the highways in the 50s, It was all those things. So the money didn't stay in the federal budget. It went out in spending projects. So it would have been okay if they didn't aggravate the problem. So let's now go with the aggravations. Okay. Medicare. Okay, we'll talk about Medicare. Let's go right down here to the first one. Lyndon Baines Johnson signing the Medicare Amendment, July 30, 1965. Former President Harry S. Truman seated at, and his wife, Bessie, was on his far right. So we have Lyndon B. Johnson and his wife behind him, and we have Harry S. Truman and his wife over here. Okay. Now, these are benefits for health insurance. They tied those to Social Security. It was already floundering by the 1970s. And then we came in 1965, 5 years earlier to 1970. And that's why we're picking this chart up in 1970 right here in 1970. Okay. And the reason why we're picking this up in 1970 is because this is when things started going bad, because 5 years earlier, they tied Medicare to it. Now, it took these people that had paid in, and we're not going to talk about Ida where she received 1,000 or times the benefits, but we are talking about people that had received 1.5, 1.7. Today, it's about 2 times what people pay in that they receive out, not including Medicare or Medicaid. But when Medicare and Medicaid later when Medicaid, when did Medicaid? Again, Medicaid was part of the 1965 Medicare. But as these programs bloated and they were supposed to be the taxes you paid in the FICA taxes and your those taxes were to pay this. But Medicare, because people, the sicker they get, the older they get, the cancer treatment, this treatment, that treatment, and what happens at people's old age. And I don't want to talk about who should or should not take care of the elderly. We're not getting into that discussion. We're just getting into the discussion that the fact is Social Security started was put in 1935, first recipient in 1940. And by the time the 1970s came along, it was in trouble. And what made that trouble was they took that money and built all this infrastructure. So they spent the money, but they're still paying out 1.5 times. And again, let's go back to this chart here in 1970, where we had, let's say 25 million people, but we had 60 million. Today we have 60 million and we have 120 million. So we were 3, 4, 5, 6 to 1. Well, by this time we were only 4 to 1. And now we're 2 to 1 paying in. And the more inflation comes, the more people receive out more than they pay in. But then when you take the liability of adding Medicare, now we have to go down, and I'm sorry, we have to go down here and talk about, where is it? It's not just Medicare. But there's Champ VA. There's Champ VA, TRICARE, and whatever the children's that were added into this in later years. Where is it? Is it here? I talked about it. Was it in Social Security or was it in but whatever. There's more than just Medicare involved in that. There is the Champ VA. Oh, where was that? It's got to be here in the Social Security. But it also covered but those programs also came into effect somewhere in the 60s and 70s. So there's a lot more involved in this. Again, they started collecting taxes in 1935, started paying out in 40. It was all right, 50s, 60s, 70s. 1970 came in because of 1965 bringing in Medicare. July 30th, 1965, we brought in Medicare, and that was supposed to be out of those FICA taxes, but they were spending those money on infrastructure and had not taken taxes out of those infrastructures to pay back the Social Security fund. And that is a shell game, fraud, whatever you want to put it, from the federal government. I don't want to get into what all happened there and the generational theft where they built up all this infrastructure, but did not bring tax revenue in to pay for that infrastructure that built this country what it is. It's just a fact. Social Security ran into trouble starting somewhere after 1965 when they added Medicare, Medicaid, Champ VA, TRICARE, and the children's Medicaid programs to the already in trouble because it went from 6 workers to 3 workers to 2 workers supporting it today. And as the baby boomers get up and all of the other explosions that happened on that, that's why we are in trouble today. And we have now also a short history of SNAP. 1939 food stamps. This is also another program that came after 1935 that was also added on to the Social Security taxes that got to be a bigger and bigger and bigger federal program funded on these Social Security taxes where they were saying, oh, there are 6 people paying in. Now there are only 2 people paying in, 2.2 people, whatever you want to call it, approximately 2 people. When we go back to this, 25 million to just 60 million. So there were 3 people paying in, and now there's only 2 people paying in per retiree. But they added Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP or food stamps, and I will put a link in the video description of how this added to this. And all they did was keep putting this on the debt. And they kept the building projects. They kept all these things and saying, oh, the Social Security will pay for it. But it is not paying for it, never has been paying for it. Okay, supplemental nutrition assistance program. You can do your own research. I will give you the links. It will explain, again, between this USDA.gov SNAP history starting in 1939 with the passing of the first bill to Wikipedia Supplemental Nutrition Act program, again, explaining the history with some other details. But all of this was supposed to be from these Social Security taxes, this FICA tax that didn't actually come in because it was already robbed from for infrastructure projects to support World War II and so on and so forth. And that's the basics of it. It was supposed to be a tax that came in, but the politicians said, oh, there's a glut, there's a glut, there's a glut. We can spend this. We have excess, when there never was an excess. And they spent it on where they spent it on things they should not have spent it on because they didn't actually hold it back to pay the Social Security benefits. This is how we came up with the bloated debt. Then they added Medicare, then they added SNAP to it, or food stamps, and now it's called SNAP. Then, now let's get into what happened in 2008, called quantitative easing. I'm going to leave the full description of what quantitative easing is. I don't have an hour to go through all of this. I will put it in the link of the description of this video below so you can have all of what this is. I am going to explain this in the simplest form I can explain it in. Okay? What it is they, out of thin air, printed a bunch of U.S. savings bonds. And again, they never funded them. They just printed money out of thin air. They issued these bonds in a 20-year bond. This is why we are going to have another crash that was put off from 2008, and they took all this money. They bailed out the United States company. They bailed out Europe. They bailed out all of these other entities. Again, same thing they did with the Social Security Fund. They were supposed to save it and pay out the Social Security, but instead they built the Grand Coolidge, they built the dams, the electricity, the Tennessee Valley Authority project. They built in the 1950s, they built the highway systems, the interstate system, and that was supposed to bring in more taxes, but it never brought in the taxes they said it was going to bring in. This was basically paying a credit card off with a credit card. Now that credit card bill, so what the government did, so basically those bonds they did until they mature in the 20 years, so from 2008 to 2028 is when they will come in. What they did, which is called selling short, they sold these bonds shorter than the value, but never did they bring taxes or revenue in to pay for this quantitative easing and these bonds basically a credit card to pay off the other credit card. And instead of paying the credit card off, they bailed out companies that were supposed to have tax revenue, but never supplied that tax revenue back into the treasury. They bailed out Europe that never paid back those loans. So this credit card, as the United States government started selling those bonds short, and once the bond is put into where they're paying out on these bonds or selling them short or having to pay out on those bonds, which will instantly cause inflation. And here's where you can see it in the United States credit rating, where we went from a AAA credit rating to a AA credit rating, down to an A credit rating, back up to a AA credit rating, all around August 5th, 2011. And this is where they started selling those bonds short from the quantitative easing. And all this is a repeat of what they did with Social Security and the fraud of Social Security, where they spent the money on infrastructure programs. The quantitative easing did the same thing. Instead of doing that, they bailed out AIG, they bailed out the insurance industry, they bailed out Europe, they bailed out a bunch of things because they were too big to fail. Instead of letting them fail and taking the consequences, then we took that and put it into a credit card that's going to be coming due, that started coming due actually in 2011. And that is why our credit rating in 2011, now that they're starting to sell those bonds off short, and that's why this country is collapsing. That's why we're having government shutdowns. That's why since basically 2002, 2004, we have not had a proper budget in the country. We have not had a legal proper budget since 2004. We've always had these continuing spending resolutions, and ever since 2011 and 2015, we have not had a legal budget in the United States. So this is explaining why we are having the collapse in the United States. Now, the next video that I'm going to try and make, I'm going to try and explain King of the North to right-wing politics in the Bible, how this all relates to the Bible and Bible prophecy. I've gone through the basic facts of Social Security, how they spent that on infrastructure and not paid the Social Security retiree and not held that money in those bonds, and they spent the money on the bonds. Then they added Medicare unfunded liability. They added Medicaid. They added SNAP and many other social programs on that Social Security, what they said was a glut, but never was a spending. It just turned into debt and debt and debt. But this quantitative easing in 2008 is what actually is putting the final death nail into the United States, because the United States cannot survive. This is going to cause a Weimar Republic, the collapse of the German Empire and the Weimar Republic in and the collapse of World War I and the German economy causing World War I, the end of World War I and World War II, and how all of that came to where we are today. we're going to end up like the German Weimar Republic because we are spending more than we are bringing in. We paid a credit card off with a credit card in this quantitative easing shell game, very similar to what the shell game of Social Security. We could have survived Social Security, but we cannot survive this quantitative easing. I've known since I was a child, back in the late 60s and early 70s, that when the United States goes down, and the phrase is, the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches the cold. And when the United States goes down through mismanagement, the same as the English before us, the Roman Empire before them, the Greek Empire, the Medo-Persia, Babylon, all of those empires. We can also trace the Eastern empires of China and all of those, and China, Mongolia, and all of those empires, as they also did not survive multiple hundreds of years, as they had changes, how communism took over. Before communism, the governments before that, the collapse of the government prior to communism in China, and all of that. So when you're starting to look at all of these governments, but as the United States was blessed by God with all of the advantages of land, resources, and everything, and we squandered it away in overspending, overreaching, through Social Security and the quantitative easing, and how we are going and losing our credit rating from a AA, or from a AAA to a AA plus, to an AA, temporarily down to A, back to a AA plus, and how all of that is coming to an end as the quantitative easing is going to hit us here in 2028, in less than 3 years. This is all going to come collapsing down. And I would like to put that into, again, how the United States in prophecy, and how the collapse of the United States and the world and Jesus Christ's return, all is tied together. But I'm establishing in this video why the United States has squandered away its blessings through the Social Security, building infrastructure instead of keeping that money and paying back the investors of the taxpayers where they said it was put in. The repeat of that with quantitative easing, and how Social Security bloated all of the social, and then the Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, food stamps, and all of that history. And then the debacle of quantitative easing, and the central banks just basically used a credit card to pay off the other credit card. And now that credit card never was funded, never had anything to pay on it, is going to collapse. But that'll be for the next video. With that said, the wrap up is the United States squandered its blessings away through overreaching in social spending, later in bailouts for companies in Europe and others, and how it relates to the King of the North, which is right-wing politics is King of the North, left-wing politics is King of the South, and how that relates to Daniel 11 and Revelation 13. So that will be the next video as soon as I can finish researching and putting it together. So with that said, out here.